particularly the question around would it be noticed if our church was there or not? I'll tell you why I put that question, because in the good old days, and I mean by that before COVID, BC, before COVID, I used to quite regularly do Kirk session conferences with churches across the land. Maybe a minister had invited me to come and lead their session, a day's conference and so on. And on one of those occasions, I asked the elders that were gathered there, I said to them, would it matter in your community if your church was there or not? And to a man and woman, of course, the elders all said, oh yes, definitely. And then what I did was I set them a few questions that would take them about half an hour or 40 minutes. And I said, right, okay, you go on with those questions. I'm going out onto the street around your church and I'm going to ask local people what they think about, whether your church would be missed or not. And I mean, I can tell you without exception, I ended up doing that maybe 5 or 6 times. And without exception, the vast majority of people that I met with outside those churches said, no, not really. So I just did that. I went outside, I walked up and down the street, and as I met with people, I kind of pointed over to the church and I said, yeah, see the church over there, would it matter to you if it was there or not? And most folk were quite blunt and just said, no, I don't go there, I've no connection, no interest, it wouldn't matter to me one bit. Some people said things like, oh yeah, well, my grandson goes to the BB there. That was that. And other people talked about the way the church hall might have been used. But really, 90% of people that I spoke to on those occasions just said, not really. And most times when I then went back into the elders' conference and told them that, they were a little irate or not deliriously happy to be given this good news. But one church in particular took it really seriously. And I know that because I spoke to the minister about 2 weeks ago, having done the Kirk Session conference maybe 15 years ago. And he said that got our attention more than anything else. The responses from people in our town saying that they wouldn't particularly miss us. And he said from that day onwards, we resolved to transform ourselves as a church, to seek to be revived as a church in such a way that the town in which we are based would be devastated if we were no longer there. Now, Fiona, you spoke about the place of the church in Castlemilk, and I know a little bit about that for myself. A great example. But if we're really, really truthful, would it matter if we were there or not to our wider communities? Let me tell you, when I took up in ministry 30 years ago, my aim, I thought my job description was something like this: build up the church, try to grow the church and so on. And in those days, in the early years of my ministry and through into the sort of second phase of my ministry, that's what happened. And again, I'm talking about pre-COVID, but we got to the point when we were averaging, and I know this figure because we counted, we were averaging 323 people on a Sunday morning, which even in those days, in the kind of early 2000s, was a big, big congregation. And I thought to myself, mission accomplished. You've achieved what you set out to do to grow the church. Our singing on Sunday morning was brilliant. We'd lots going on inside the church, and I thought, this is brilliant, isn't it? This is fantastic. And then I began to get a nagging sense of doubt building up within me, a question, if you will, that just wouldn't go away. And the question was something like this: you built the church up, but so what? So what? In other words, is that the end in itself? Is that just what matters to build up the church? And out of that nagging question, came a growing sense that it isn't enough. And that the whole point of building up a strong church is so that that strong church can begin to impact the wider community around it. Okay? That it can begin to impact the wider community around it. And in so doing, that it can begin to join in with what God is doing. And this is what I mentioned earlier, the verse from the letter to the Colossians. In Christ, God is in the business of reconciling all things to himself. And it seemed to me, and ultimately my Kirk session, that's what we had to be in the business of. I mentioned it earlier, that it wasn't enough just to say, we've got a fantastic church, look how many people come on a Sunday. We had to start saying, how many people go out from our church, how many people go in the name of Christ into the community, how many people are out there making an impact in our wider community. And at that point, prior to that epiphany, if I can call it that, I would have to say that the answer was not really many. And though we thought it was brilliant on a Sunday morning, I really don't think if it had closed back then that many people would have noticed it. I think now, as Fiona said about Castlemilk, I think now I could say definitely it would be missed. And that's about how we have turned ourselves around through the years from being about gathering in, bringing people to church, to an emphasis on sending people out from church. Now, obviously, COVID pandemic really was hurtful for all churches, I'm sure, but certainly when it comes to missional activity and so on. So we, like many others, are really in business of picking up again after COVID, but I'm sure we will because we have the mindset. Now, let me get a little bit practical about some of what we went about, some of what I've heard from other places and so on. Because it's one thing to say, we've got to be missional. We've got to be in mission. It's not about David Livingstone anymore. It's about us and how we step out the door and be involved in mission. So what might that actually look like? Let me offer several strands of how that might work. All of which we have done, we have road tested, and we have found to work in one sense or another. The first of those strands, I'm going to call this acts of random kindness. Now, I don't know if you ever saw a film years ago. It was called Evan Almighty, and it was a kind of take on the Noah's Ark story. And in the gist of that film, they were talking about the word ark, obviously Noah and his ark. And they used the word ark to mean that, acts of random kindness. And sitting in the movie theatre that day, I just grabbed that. I thought, there you go, I'm going to use this for sure in church. So we started that business of acts of random kindness. And we will need to resume it again now that COVID is mostly by. But here's what it looked like in practice. We just got involved in our community in those ways. So give me some examples. On Valentine's Day each year, we used to go out onto the streets of our town, and I mean me and elders, because make no mistake about it, as I said earlier, this can't be done by ministers. So elders, members for sure, we would just be on our streets and we would say to people, hi, did you get a Valentine's card today? And of course, some people said yes, and we thought, oh, that was nice. But when people said to us, no, nobody sent me a Valentine's card, then we gave them a little foil-covered chocolate shaped like a heart. And tied onto it was a little card which said, somebody loves you. And then a wee greeting from St. Andrew's Church. It was just a small thing, but it was one of many that we did. And what it had the effect of doing was building up the profile of the church in the community. So, for example, at Easter, our team would be up at 5 o'clock on Easter morning, and we'd go round to all the doors in the parish, and we would leave a bunch of daffodils on a doorstep and a packet of hot cross buns, and always a little card with it saying, "A gift from St Andrew's Church to bless you for a happy Easter," and so on and so on. So these were happening regularly. And what began to happen was you would go to some person with a chocolate on Valentine's Day, and they would say, "Oh, is that the church that brought us daffodils and hot cross buns at Easter time?" And you say, "Yes, that's the church." So gradually this raising of the profile. And you can't overestimate how important it is to raise the profile of your church in terms of the beginnings of missional activity. Many years ago, I had to go up to Aberdeen to a meeting that was in a church in Aberdeen. And I didn't know then Aberdeen very well. So I just drove on and thought, I'll find it. And I've got a good Scots tongue in my head, so I'll ask people. So I got into the neighbourhood of where this church was, and I started saying to people, "Can you point me to such and such church?" Well, I've remembered it to this day. I asked 16 people before I found one who knew where the church was. Now, if I'd asked the church members, of course they knew where it was. They go to it all the time. But here they were with a church that had such a low profile that most people didn't even know where it was. So this business of acts of random kindness shows something of who we are and a little bit of profile. The final example of that, we used to in our Arbroath have a thing called Seafest. Every year in the summer, it was a celebration of the life of the sea and the harbour and fishing industry and all of those things. And we used to be present every year at Seafest. And one year in particular, we got our congregation to gather cans of Coke for months in advance, such that we ended up with like 3,000 cans of Coke. And we went down to Seafest, we set up our stall, and then my members, again, I'm going to say elders because they were key to it, they then had the task of mingling amongst the thousands who came to Seafest. And what we did was this, we went up to people and said, "Real or diet? Real or diet?" And folks kind of said, "Pardon?" And we said, "It's a gift. Can of Coke, do you want real Coke or diet Coke?" And folks were quite taken aback. And many of them then began to dig into their pockets to bring out the money to pay for it, at which point we said, "No, it's a gift." And little conversations started from that. People would say, "Oh, there's nothing free in this world anymore." And we were able to say, "Do you know, the best things are. The best things are." So we gave them a can of Coke with little conversations, and we gave them out a little card for our church. So those are what I call acts of random kindness. And I think they're brilliantly easy to do, and they help considerably with getting people's mindset from the church to be about going out and engaging with people. Yes, for some, it takes them out of their comfort zone, but you're never going to be a disciple if you stay in your comfort zone. Your church is never going to be missional if you stay in your comfort zone. The second strand, I think, is this: bite-sized opportunities for service. Now, I stole that phrase from Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York, where I was a worshipper one Sunday morning. I heard that phrase. You know, folks, there are very few new things under the sun. But one thing I've developed a skill at through the years is stealing good ideas. And you know, there's no copyright in the kingdom of God, so you can steal quite happily. And there I was in that church in New York, and they talked about this program they ran, bite-sized opportunities for service. And I thought, wow, I love that. That's fantastic. So we started to run that at our church. And here's what it was in a nutshell. We connected with groups in our community who were doing what we considered to be kingdom work. So, for example, we had a Bernardo's group in our Arbroath, which ran a project called Hopscotch. Hopscotch was about supporting children where one or both parents were abusing alcohol. and so therefore where the children were deemed to be at risk to one extent or another. Hopscotch provided mentors and befrienders for those children. We heard about that programme and we thought, brilliant, absolutely fantastic scheme. Now, we had a decision to make at that point. Do we start up our own scheme just like that? Or do we acknowledge that it's already happening and join in? This is what I mean by saying the mission is God's. He's already doing it. We've got to look for it and find out and join in. So we got the Hopscotch folk from Bernardo's to come to our church one Sunday morning. I gave them 5 minutes to describe hopscotch. And then at the end of it, I said to my members, does anybody sense the Spirit of God giving them a little nudge or a prompt that you could be a hopscotch volunteer? 7 folks volunteered that morning and became hopscotch volunteers. It was great. And out they went to get involved in the community in that kingdom work. So we multiplied those. Almost every month, we offered a new opportunity for service. And you know, folks, we pretty well got to the point where the vast majority of folks in the church were involved that way, understanding that it wasn't just about coming to church, it was about going out from church. Now, some people said, oh, well, some people might say, you know, in your churches, oh, well, we need all our volunteers just to keep our church going. You know, we need all our volunteers for all of the jobs around church. Well, that's when it becomes club and not church. When we can start to give ourselves away and give the life of the church to the wider community, then mission begins to take place. So we've got acts of random kindness, and we've got bite-sized opportunities for service. And the final thing doesn't so much have a catchy title, but it would be this. We also looked for where the gaps in the market were. And way back in the early 2000s, we'd so many people coming to our church, and always with great tales about how they'd lost their wallet, or my granny lives in Blairgowrie and she's really unwell. I need the bus fare to go back to see her. And you've heard every story under the sun. It was always we need money because we've got an addiction problem, etc., etc. And we got to the point of thinking, is there nothing we can do to support people in that situation? Out of that question came our Havilah project, which began in 2006, so it's been running for 16 years now. And it became a project for people suffering from drug addiction. Started very slowly, and then it picked up. It started Monday mornings. It now runs every day of the week. It's got its own centre. It's got 3 staff members. It has absolutely mushroomed because the need is there. We have welcomed, literally in those 16 years, over, and I'm counting out, in the thousands of men and women who have come to our project for support. And many, many have found freedom from addiction. Many have found purpose in life again and meaning. Many have had family relationships restored. Many went to college. Many got work, and so on. And folks, the more you begin to get the church involved in your communities, and I say again, it can't just be the minister's work. We're all called to this, chiefly elders. When we get that level of involvement in our communities, it suddenly does matter that we are there. Our MSP for the Arbroath area is very upfront about being an atheist. He says that quite clearly. But here's the thing, I meet with them pretty regularly, whether online or chatting in one way or another. Because he, and despite being an atheist, came to see the value of what we were about. And that begins to tell you about the impact you're making and the difference that it makes that your church is there. And friends, that is the missional mindset. Not about gathering in as if that was the end in itself, but sending out, all of us, one by one, where we are in our neighbourhoods, and just watch how things begin to happen from there. You know, I honestly, this gets me so excited. You could go on for another hour on this, but I know the time will run away from us, so I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, folks, as I've shared those various things with you. Thanks.